You ever wonder why Jesus, right in the middle of his ministry, just completely changed his teaching style? I mean, he goes from speaking plainly in these famous sermons to telling stories about seeds and soils and hidden treasure. Well, these stories are way more than just simple illustrations. They actually mark a huge turning point in his entire ministry. So let's find out why. And this is really the big question we're going to tackle. Most of us probably grew up thinking parables were just simple stories to make things easier to follow. But what if? What if they were actually designed to do the exact opposite for some people? What if they were a kind of spiritual code? So, we're about to kick off a whole journey to unpack all of Jesus's parables. And this explainer right here is the essential first step. You should really think of it as the master key. It's the one piece of information you need to unlock the meaning behind all the others.
Okay, so to get to the why, we first have to look at the when. Because this switch to teaching in parables, it wasn't a slow burn. It was sudden, it was dramatic, and it happened at a very specific moment.
So take a look at this timeline from Matthew's Gospel. Before chapter 12, Jesus is teaching wide open. The Sermon on the Mount is the perfect example. It's direct, it's clear, you know exactly what he means. But then, bam, Matthew chapter 12 happens. The religious leadership of Israel officially rejects him, even accusing him of working for Satan. And then, immediately, in the very next chapter, on that same day, the whole style changes. He starts speaking almost exclusively in parables to the crowds. That is no coincidence. It is a massive turning point.
Which brings us right back to our core question. The man who is teaching with such incredible clarity suddenly seems to be speaking in riddles. What on earth prompted this change? Why start hiding the message now?
Well, the answer, straight from the text itself, is that the parables were designed to do two things at once. They were a tool for both judgment and revelation. And which one you got depended entirely on the state of your heart. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating, because this is Jesus' own explanation broken down. First, for his disciples, the people who genuinely wanted to understand, the parables would open up these deep spiritual truths. Second, for the crowds and the leaders who had already rejected the clear light he'd given them, the parables would now conceal that truth. It was a form of judgment. If you reject the light you have, you won't be given any more. And third, this very act actually fulfilled Old Testament prophecies that said the Messiah would speak in a way that people would hear but not understand. And this idea gets driven home when the disciples pull him aside and ask him directly why he's speaking in parables. This was his answer. He drew a clear line in the sand. For you, the seekers, these mysteries are being unlocked. For them, the rejectors, they're being hidden. This wasn't an accident. It was a completely deliberate strategy. Okay, so what were these mysteries that the parables were suddenly revealing? Well, they were truths about a whole new phase of God's plan, something the text calls the mystery kingdom. Let's define that term, because it is absolutely crucial. The mystery kingdom is essentially God's program on earth right now, in this whole period between Jesus' first coming and his future second coming. It describes the state of things while the king is physically absent, but his influence is spreading. Yeah, the term Christendom is a pretty good one-word summary. Now, to really get why this was a mystery, you have to understand what everyone was expecting. The Old Testament prophesied this massive, physical, earthly, visible messianic kingdom, with the Messiah ruling on the throne of David. But after the rejection, Jesus starts describing this other form of the kingdom, one that would exist while he was away. It would grow quietly, like a seed, and its workings would often be hidden from the world. This was the new truth the parables were designed to explain. And this mystery kingdom has some very specific characteristics. It's not limited to one nation anymore. It includes both Jews and Gentiles. And, this is critical, it contains a mixture of both true believers and people who only say they have faith, what Jesus calls the wheat and the tares growing together in the same field. It really describes our entire era. So, if the parables are a kind of code describing this mystery kingdom, how are we supposed to crack it? Did Jesus give us a key? The answer is a definite yes. This quote is just astonishing. Jesus says this to his disciples about the very first parable he tells, the parable of the sower. He essentially says, hey, if you don't get this one, you're not going to get any of the others. He literally identifies it as the foundational key to interpretation. The core principle for interpreting them is understanding the difference between the figure and the reality. The figure is the simple, everyday picture in the story. A sower, some seed, different kinds of soil. The reality is the spiritual truth that figure stands for. To understand the parable, you have to know what the figures represent.
And this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If we just guess what the seed or the soil means, we can make the parables say absolutely anything we want. So how do we find the correct meaning without just making it up?
The answer is simple. We let Jesus explain it himself. Later in Matthew 13, the disciples ask him to explain the parable of the wheat and the tares. And look what he does. He provides a perfect one-for-one decoding key. The field isn't Israel, it's the world. The good seed isn't the gospel, it's the sons of the kingdom. The tares are the sons of the evil one. He defines every single figure.
And so, the crucial point is this. Our interpretation isn't guesswork. Jesus provides the model. By carefully studying the parables that he himself explains, we get the codebook for understanding the ones he doesn't. He shows us exactly how to do it. All right, so let's just step back for a second and look at the framework we've built. Here are the essential takeaways. First, we saw that the shift to parables wasn't random. It was a deliberate response to rejection. Second, we learned their dual purpose, to conceal truth from the hard-hearted, but reveal it to the seeker. Third, these stories describe the mystery kingdom, which is the reality of God's work in our present age. And finally, and most importantly, we don't have to guess at the meaning because Jesus himself gives us the key to interpret them. Now that we have the framework, we are ready to use the master key. In the next part of this series, we're going to dive deep into the one parable Jesus said is essential for understanding all the others, the parable of the sower and the four soils. And we're not just going to study it as some ancient story. We're going to use Jesus' own explanation to make it intensely personal, asking the one question that matters most to each of us. Which soil am I?